Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my pleasure to be your haunted host for this episode. It's the early 1920s in Los Angeles, the era of prohibition and gangsters in a city that is high on Hollywood and newly released talking pictures. You see some people regularly going to your neighbor's door who seem to be pulling out money to be admitted into the darkened house. Later in the night, you hear strange noises next door. Was that a scream? Otherwise, the gathering appears to be quite quiet, nothing disturbing. A couple hours after it began, everyone leaves in a bit of a daze. The event repeats itself regularly. The faces are curiously different, but also the same. You hesitate a bit, but you're worried about those people going to your neighbor's house. So you pick up the phone and call a number that has been advertised in the local papers. You describe the situation: a gather of seemingly strangers, fairly regular occurrence, money exchanged at the door, a bit of screaming, but otherwise quiet. The group leaves promptly. Are you worried about illicit alcohol or perhaps gambling taking place? No, it's nothing like that. You know your neighbors. They're strange, but not gangsters. You've called this phone line to get a hold of the so-called Ghost Squad associated with the Los Angeles Police Department. You ask for them by name, as you've seen their picture in the newspaper. Just as their name implies, this Ghost Squad was formed to investigate ghosts, or more accurately, the absence of ghosts. Yes, in 1920s LA, there was a special division of police that were called to investigate mediums who either misrepresented themselves and faked seances, or people who were conducting these gatherings without a license. Regular people were encouraged to call in and report their neighbors if they suspected that these illicit gatherings were taking place. So it's the 1920s in LA, and you suspect there's a fake seance going on next door. Who are you gonna call? The Ghost Squad, of course. There were ghost squads appearing across the country to fight organized crime and uncover prohibition violations. They were called the Ghost Squad because they wore regular clothing and tried to infiltrate criminal networks, like contemporary undercover agents or spies. The concept was relatively novel for police departments at the time, and the practice was gaining some traction in different jurisdictions. But as far as we can tell, there was only one ghost squad that exclusively looked into fraudulent mediums. Although the name and mandate were very unique, police had been investigating suspected frauds for over half a century by this point. In this episode, we'll delve into the other side of seances, the side where enterprising fraudsters sought to get as much money as possible from a popular fad, while investigators and a frustrated public used Scooby-Doo-like tactics to try to expose them. As we launch into this topic, it's important to consider seances and mediums more generally. There are many people who have purportedly held genuine seances where they claim to make contact with the dead. Some identify as mediums or seers or psychics, saying they have a special ability to see to the other side. For the purposes of this episode, we're not exploring or questioning the practice of seances or the identity of mediums. We're specifically looking at historical figures who have been exposed as frauds, who are in the business solely to make money. Their crimes, which were extremely widespread in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were not victimless and ended up tarnishing the reputation of genuine spiritualists and investigators, still affecting the validity of paranormal research and practice to this day. But before we get to that, if you plan to watch the coronation of King Charles this weekend, you'll see that the ceremonies are full of symbolism and history. One of the most interesting things to look for is the Stone of Destiny, which is positioned under the coronation chair. Now, this is no ordinary rock, and its history is complex, full of bloodshed and mystery. It's been stolen several times, and there is even uncertainty if the stone that will be there is the actual historical artifact. This week, I wrote a blog post about the Stone of Destiny, so if you're going to be watching the ceremony, you may want to check that post out, and you can find that on our website, hauntedwalk.com/news. This upcoming weekend is a big one for us. It marks the return of two of our ghost tours in Kingston, Ontario, the Ghosts of Queen's University and the Ghosts of Fort Henry both return with a vengeance. The tour of Queen's University is one of our newest offering and is full of great ghost stories. And Fort Henry, well, it's a unique place you really have to visit. And to be there at night in the tunnels after the fort, when things are quiet and eerie, well, if you love scary stories, that is a place you want to be. This weekend, we also have paranormal investigations taking place at the SDG Jail in Cornwall, Ontario, as well as a whole slate of other ghost tours in Toronto and Ottawa as well. For information about any of our experiences, including our virtual haunted campfires and the haunting at home, which you can join into from anywhere in the world, please visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen, and we hope you will follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, for our latest updates, spooky memes, and spine-tingling stories. There are plenty of resources out there about the rise and popularity of seances and attempts to contact the dead during the Victorian era. Since it's been covered on this podcast and written about on our blog, I won't go into too much detail, but here are the highlights. The concept of seances have been around for centuries in various countries around the world, but the contemporary practice that we know today gained popularity during the Victorian era. It was a culture obsessed with the macabre and mortality, while people were simultaneously navigating a rapidly advancing world while wanting to remain connected with the past. Science was making discoveries and adding to our understanding of our surroundings in very new ways, while others were questioning old religious teachings. In this era of new ideas and seemingly endless possibilities, people became fixated on contacting the deceased, departed relatives, celebrities, unknown paranormal entities, even animals. Seances were a way that everyday people could possibly make contact with the other side, but they likely needed some guidance. Into our story walks mediums, or psychics, people who claim to have a special ability to contact spirits. Everyday folks would have been familiar with these types of people, as they've been around many cultures for millennia. But now there was a public fervor and an eager audience, some of whom were burgeoning scientists hoping to gather proof of the paranormal, while others were regular people just out for an entertaining evening. Everyone, from many different walks of life and curiosities, came together at a séance, each with their own agendas. Many people who attended and popularized séances were part of a growing movement called spiritualism. While there was no single text or governing rules like mainstream religions, believers of spiritualism held some core beliefs, one of which was the dead could be contacted on the other side as spirits. But as spiritualism gained momentum in the public realm, there was suddenly money to be made. And once people started getting rich, the fraudsters appeared. It seems apparent that many early spiritualists were genuinely interested in developing new forms of contacting the other side and gathering the evidence that it was possible. However, even the so-called founders of the spiritualist movement were motivated by the spectacle and getting famous. The Fox sisters were 3 American women known for conjuring up spirits who would respond to questions by rapping, making some kind of knocking noise. The sisters eventually became so famous that they traveled internationally, embarking on luxurious trips to show off their amazing abilities. Although it is still unclear how much of the sisters' abilities were faked, it's accepted that at least some of their scheme was a fraud. By the late 19th century, the Fox sisters had largely been discredited, but the techniques that they popularized were now in the public realm and being regularly exploited. It is difficult to determine which fraudulent spiritualist started out their trade in a genuine attempt to contact the dead. But for many, attracting the crowds that would pay their bills meant constantly producing the so-called spirits that people paid to witness. If you have tried ghost explorations or investigations yourself, you know that the other side is unreliable and often quite quiet. But running a successful seance business meant convincing people that you were the real thing. Even if you had these real abilities, conjuring up spirits on a weekly or even daily basis was nearly impossible. Others were so interested in genuine spiritualism that they learned the trade of fake mediums to uncover frauds. In 1904, Laura Hyland confessed to conducting and participating in countless fake seances. She initially learned from Elise Reynolds, a known fraud, so she could expose fakes. Hyland said, "There is a great good in spiritualism, and it is a shame that these frauds should be permitted to continue." But yet, she herself ended up becoming a fake. She purported that her motivation was solely to expose the truth and save vulnerable people. But she continued in this fake trade for many years and likely raked in a large profit. So how exactly did the fakes do it? What were their go-to techniques? Seances during this time were usually performed with a very common prop, a cabinet. Think of a large wardrobe or armoire, usually affixed with curtains instead of doors. The medium would usually be tied up, supposedly to prevent any tricks, and placed inside the cabinet, often seated in a chair. Sometimes the medium would be tied in the cabinet with ropes around their neck and waist. These techniques dispelled skeptic claims, but were also part of the conjuring techniques, or so the frauds said. When the seance was set to begin, the group would usually sing or chant. Surprising to some, they often sang Christian hymns. The lamps would be dimmed and the curtains drawn, which created an interesting play of shadows and concealed tricks like trapdoors or associates of the medium who would suddenly appear. Spirits would then come through the curtains or around the cabinet where the medium sat. The spirits would often be cloaked in light fabrics that played with the dim lights and concealed the identities of the performers. Mediums who appeared to be in a trance would sometimes use ventriloquism to mimic sounds of the dead. Other mediums, who were skilled in getting out of rope ties, would manage to free themselves and dress up as different conjured spirits using the cover of darkness. While these techniques may seem almost obvious to us today, this was still a novel concept for many people, and they didn't suspect a fraud was taking place. In fact, in 1895, a fake seance was held in New York. The event was advertised as fake, and everyone in attendance was aware that it was a performance. Still, many leaving the event reported that they could have easily been fooled, and at times even suspected that the seance might be real. Exposing these frauds became a common subject in the popular press, and many of these stories had a sarcastic tone that must have entertained readers at the time. In St. Louis, in 1885, a Mr. and Mrs. George Miller were exposed when a participant became overly enthusiastic and attempted to touch the spirit. As quoted in the rather humorous account, one of the gentlemen not only captured a spirit, but ascertained that the kind of robes the angels wear is nothing but simple penny cambric, and that the thin veil which at seances hides the glory of forms and faces celestial is only plain, unpoetic, very material mosquito bar. Performing fake seances was also dangerous, as a 1908 report from Buffalo recounts. The spirit in this case had got her robe entangled in the corners of a bookcase that stood on one side of the room, and, in attempting to retreat to the cabinet, had pulled the whole case full of books down upon her. There was a scream, a panic. The lights were turned up to disclose the medium in a state of terror, and her poor confederate pinned beneath the bookcase on the floor, groaning from her injuries. She was carried to the hospital in an ambulance, where she was confined for 6 weeks before she was discharged, let us hope, a wiser and better woman. The police got involved in breaking up these events and seemed intent on ensuring that fakes were caught and publicly shamed. They were usually charged with fraud or obtaining money under false pretenses. The charge didn't carry a lot of weight and likely didn't scare a lot of mediums out of their trade. Still, they were careful to keep police out of their events, so investigations often had to get creative. In 1904, a journalist participated in an elaborate expose that eventually resulted in the arrest of Harry Crindle and his wife. The journalist managed to attend multiple seances, eventually gaining the trust of the couple and inviting more and more friends, some of whom ended up being police officers. When the perfect moment came, the officers descended on the cabinet and found Mrs. Crindle in the middle of a costume change. She was carted off to jail in her spirit robes. That seance bust was a little less dramatic than a situation that unfolded in New York, where an officer stepped in to arrest Henry Rogers, a famous medium in the city, and was subsequently punched by Elias Whitmore. The assaulter was a middle-aged janitor who had nothing to do with the medium, but had assumed the officer was trying to interfere with the spirits. Perhaps some of you are questioning the true extent of the harm caused by fake mediums. After all, they weren't charging exorbitant rates for individual entry to their seances. If anything, they deceived people a few dollars, and that was it. While some enterprising businessmen had much grander ideas. In Central California, the problem of spirit mines was on everyone's radar in the early 1900s. During a seance or personal reading, mediums would claim to receive advice from beyond that pushed wealthy clients to purchase mining stock. Like many financial scams, the first investors did make some money, and soon the idea of spirit mines spread through the elite circles of California. In a later expose, some members of the scheme said that it started out as a joke that poked fun at the ultra-rich, but quickly became serious when they were handed wads of cash in exchange for mining stock that didn't even exist. There were many people who were concerned about the prevalence of fraudulent spiritualists, but the most vocal were those who envisioned themselves as real believers and genuine practitioners. Spiritualist groups tried to distance themselves from the fraudulent activities, taking out space in newspapers to proclaim their disgust at the money-grabbing schemes. Despite all of the safeguards that organizations put in place, spiritualist groups were not immune to fakes. There was some effort to weed out the fakes and simultaneously prove that spiritualism was a legitimate practice. It was common in the early 20th century for intellectuals, mainly public figures and scientists, to offer substantial rewards to anyone who could prove the material existence of ghosts. Unlike many studies we might be used to today, they weren't trying to disprove the paranormal. In fact, most were interested in proving to a skeptical public that spiritualism was real. In 1923, there was a very high-profile reward on offer, with none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as one of the judges. For anyone who could either photograph a spirit or produce a snippet of ghostly ectoplasm, they would be rewarded $2,500 in lifelong infamy. It appears the reward went unclaimed. By the 1920s, the popularity of seances exploded. Following the aftermath of the First World War, coupled with an era of easygoing partying in the Prohibition era, seance outings were a common date night and even family affair. But, as with the Victorian period, a few decades before, there was a wave of fraudulent schemes that roped in unsuspecting and sometimes vulnerable patrons. Plenty of people were calling for an end to seances altogether. In 1920, just as spiritualism was on the rise again, a group of influential Catholics warned parishioners that seances should be avoided by all good Catholics. Failing to do so may lead to encounters with so-called evil spirits. As with before, the police were also called in to deal with the situation. But this time, they tried to use clearer laws to prosecute people, not simply generic fraud charges. In some places, seances were outlawed altogether. For example, in parts of Montana, seances were formally banned in 1922. Anyone leading or participating in such an event could face prison time. Other places, notably California, tried to regulate the practice by introducing licensing for anyone practicing spiritualism as a living. People like mediums and fortune tellers were forced to get a license and pay an annual fee for renewal. Part of the idea was to cut down on the fraudsters by encouraging only legitimate practitioners to get the license. But how could a license prove that you were genuine? There was no test or abilities you had to demonstrate. You simply had to fork over the fee to the municipality or county and ensure it was on hand in case an event was raided. You could get accredited by a spiritualist organization and have your license fast-tracked, but those were fraught with frauds as well. Despite its questionable outcomes, the licensing scheme spread throughout California, and consequently, the Ghost Squad of LA was born. The Ghost Squad was made up of men and women of the LAPD who dressed in plain clothes and attended seances looking for frauds. Like some of their predecessors, these detectives often played the long game, attending the same medium seances a few times to detect possible signs of deception. Sometimes they simply checked for licenses and found that the medium didn't have one, a rather anticlimactic form of justice. At other times, they were engaged in the spectacular scene that has been named ghost grabbing. This is how the LA Evening Post record from March 10, 1926, described their work. For the past month, the women and men detectives have been daring the mysteries of the ethereal world, from actually grabbing materialized forms, which turn out to be solid flesh and bone, to whispering to relatives brought back from the Valley of Death by licensed and unlicensed ghost finders. The Ghost Squad was very busy, it seemed, reporting in the spring of 1926 that 24 mediums had already been arrested and 12 were under surveillance. During the first half of 1926, newspapers in LA were splashed with stories about the latest busts by the Ghost Squad. Jack Freelander, city prosecutor at the time, was determined to clean up the city of LA. He focused his time on investigating the seedy crimes that were already making LA famous, ensuring that all violators were brought to justice. His sweep included those operating seances and other fake spiritualist practices for profit without a license. While the Ghost Squad began weeding out these supposed fake mediums, Jim Bolger, a writer with the LA Evening Post record, was recounting his day-to-day experiences with spiritualist mediums in LA. The regular column, titled Hunting Ghosts, ran alongside the stories of the busts. At times, Bolger had just recently interviewed a medium for his column before they were arrested for violating the licensing laws. Bolger's column must have attracted some interest as it gradually moved to the front page of the paper. His writing, part serious journalism, part sarcasm, clearly conveyed his own skepticism over many of the people he encountered. One of the most famous busts from the 1926 Ghost Squad was the uncovering of the Thompson family. They were nicknamed the $1 Million Mediums because of all the cash they had raked in over the years. No stranger to controversy, the Thompson family had been investigated and even prosecuted before. They had left their native Chicago after officials grew more suspicious of Elizabeth Thompson's incredible abilities. She advertised her show, Do the Dead Return, in local newspapers, drumming up plenty of business in the early 1920s. But the family quickly moved on, likely due to the pursuit of the Chicago police. In 1923, the Thompsons were performing in New York when their reputation was further tarnished after a spectator managed to bite the materialized ghost that appeared during the seance. As described in the newspaper at the time, Dick Gallagher one of the spectators at the seance, took the principal role in the spook-breaking episode. Gallagher, whose aid came without being solicited, was still picking ectoplasm from his teeth today, and he has found that the ectoplasm is made of cheesecloth. He made his discovery because he bit the ghost, the shade of his grandmother at that. The spiritualists who had put on the show were outraged, stating they were not going to tolerate such imposters. The Thompsons were driven out of New York and eventually landed in LA, where they quickly got the attention of the Ghost Squad. It didn't take them long to become the highest profile arrest of the fake mediums. The Thompsons were eventually prosecuted and then completely faded from the public view. Some of our listeners may be disappointed to hear the Ghost Squad of the LAPD no longer exists. In fact, after the spring of 1926, headlines about breaking up fake seances quickly faded into the mists of history. It seems that the squad did what they set out to do and scared enough fake mediums out of the business. Of course, California still remains a hotspot for psychics and mediums, those genuinely practicing the craft and those trying to swindle people. So the Ghost Squad didn't completely eliminate seances from the Pacific state. But the popularity of spiritualism gradually declined, and the economic depression of the 1930s sent the practice back to the boundaries of society. Not until the 1980s did these practices once again capture the attention of the public, and particularly the police. But that's a story for another episode. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Be sure to check out our blog post on the Stone of Destiny, which will play an important role in this weekend's coronation. You can find that on our website, hauntedwalk.com/news. And on our website, you can also find information and purchase tickets for upcoming ghost tours, paranormal investigations, and our online experiences. Please be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen, and we hope we can connect with you on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, where we share our latest news, spooky memes, and other spine-tingling tales. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this episode, and Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, my friends, sweet dreams.